We've all got that. Anyway, this webinar will follow the usual format, and that means I'm doing the hellos and making sure everyone is happy. You keep your microphone switched off, please, so that the presentation can go ahead. Cara Haggerty Wilson will do our presentation. She's our guest for this month, and that will be followed by our usual Q&A from our own Scott Foster. If you have a question that you want to ask, you either raise your hand virtually and Scott will catch you on that, or type it into the chat and he will ask it for you. But we'll do that after the presentation when Cara is finished. So it will be just 1 hour. We'll finish at 5 o'clock, so you'll get back to your day. So I'm just going to introduce Cara. Cara Haggerty Wilson is a Philadelphia-based architect and passive house consultant at Onion Flats Architecture. Since joining Onion Flats in 2017, her experience at the firm has shifted from the architect as developer and builder model to a renewed focus on designing and consulting on client-based high-performance projects, with specific interest in deep energy retrofits along the East Coast and beyond. So I'm going to hand over to Cara, and I'm going to mute myself, and I'll keep admitting people as they come on. So here, Cara, it's over to you.
Great, thank you. Let me open my screen or share my screen. So hopefully everybody can see this. I'm going to be doing a presentation on deep energy exterior retrofits with an emphasis on exterior. So we're going to be doing all of our major envelope improvements as an overclad in 2 examples. This is part of a larger presentation where we had 3 projects, but we've culled it down to 2, and I still might have to speed through some stuff because there's just a lot of information in this presentation. But we have 20 minutes, so in talking about deep energy exterior retrofits, the goal here is how do we detail them? What do they cost? And how do you consider the decision-making process for these complex projects? Yeah. I'm just going to move some stuff around here. So when we started to think about the DEERs that we've been working on in our firm, we're getting kind of a variety of scale. We've got 20-unit projects, we've got 120-unit projects, and things in between. And we started to really try to identify what are the kind of 3 major principles for decision making that you could kind of track through every major decision in a DEER or a DER for that matter. The obvious one being the CO2 emissions reduction. That's the reason why you're even involved in the project, is because you want to drastically improve the performance of the building and kind of decarbonize it through electrification, envelope improvements, smart material selection, system upgrades, and assessing solar. The other 2 that really started to become apparent as we worked through projects, and the first one in particular, the occupant impact, which is a loaded kind of topic because you can think of it from the occupant impact during construction and what that means for the people living in a DER project, whether or not they need to be relocated for weeks or a day or hours or not at all. Maybe they're a vulnerable tenant population to begin with, so there's very special concerns you need to consider. Maybe the project is phased to try to relax some of those negative impacts. On the other end of that is the kind of the positive outlook of the occupant impact post-construction. So the deliverable to the occupant after you have achieved a really good airtight insulated building with a great ventilation system. So tracking on that and also becoming a decision-making factor throughout the process as we're looking at systems, as we're looking at overclad, constantly kind of honing in on that topic. And then in a similar vein, replicability, which is the idea that we could kind of create a kit of parts or a set of directives that help us understand when a building is a good fit for a DER, but also making, maybe there's like a a typical assembly that makes a lot of sense for one type of building and another typical assembly that makes a lot of sense for a different type of building. So you need to start looking at building typology, the existing assembly materials, combustible versus non-combustible. You need to start looking at existing systems and how they're laid out, if it's centralized versus decentralized. And then just from the basic, like if we're overcladding a building, obviously the complexity of form of an existing building becomes really important. You'll see in the first example, we started out thinking we could panelize this thing, but the more we learned about the building, while on the surface it looks pretty typical and repetitive, we found that it truly wasn't. So we're kind of, as we go through the process of design and understanding existing building, always also looking back to replicability. What are we doing that could foster more variations on this result? We don't want to just have one unique answer for every building. We want to make this something that we can use over and over again, if possible. But it's not working. So the first kind of case study is called Hano Homes. This is located in Austin, Brighton, Massachusetts, which is in Boston. And this project is currently under construction. So you'll see some construction photos as well. Really quickly, the building stats. It's one owner. It's a nonprofit owner, and they've had the building for some time, although the original construction date is in the 1890s. It's set up like a series of townhouses. So there's 10 lots, and on every lot, there's a duplex. So there's 20 dwelling units. It's wood frame construction, a mix of 2 and 3 bedrooms. And on the surface, this looks like a cookie cutter. Those 10 buildings are the same, but mirrored. Once we started to dig in, we realized there's some challenges that relate to the kind of uniqueness of this project, one being the age and the amount of times it's been modified. So while they may have started out like a cookie cutter project, they are no longer exist that way. Even their interior layouts are slightly different. So as we were looking for solutions, we started off thinking we could panelize. The more we dug in and we saw the complexity of the bays, the complexity of the steps and how they interact with the building, the tight site, the utilities on the site. You see the utility pole there. Everybody has their own service, so there's just a lot of wires. We started to realize pretty quickly that a site-built project is going to be more efficient, and so that's the direction this project went down. And then really quick on the stats. So with every project, we do an estimated baseline EUI to understand the kind of current performance of the building and where it stands. This one came in at a 59.2 kb2 per square foot year, which is certainly not the worst we've seen. So this, in a weird way, is not too bad. And you'll see in a few slides why. This is just a site plan kind of showing the overall layout. And then really quickly, the floor plans, just identifying everything's a little bit different as you go down the row. So the kitchens aren't always the same. The baths are slightly different. So when we started to think about a typical intervention for new systems, each one kind of needed to be tweaked a little bit. There wasn't just one solution. And then just also acknowledging the occupant impact portion of this was we started off thinking we didn't need to move anybody out. That was the goal. We're going to have systems that start in the basement, which are, non-occupiable space for the tenants, the low ceilings, it's just equipment. We're going to find our way to the exterior and we're going to work through the overclad to feed the units so that these people don't need to leave their units. The more we got into that and the complexities of the little intricacies of this building slightly different than that one, and the deck sizes needing to be just so, we started to pull that scope back into the building. And so maybe midway through the project, the idea of tenant relocation became a real thing, and we needed to start phasing how the contractor could reasonably execute flipping a whole townhouse, 2 units in 2 weeks and moving along. So we're basically taking people, putting them in an empty unit, flipping their unit in 2 weeks, moving them back in, and then doing the same thing until we get to the full project, 20 units complete. And so we have a tight turnaround for the contractor. So far, it's working out well. And it still costs money, obviously. Relocation is an expensive thing. So even at just 2 weeks, we're kind of maximizing what the owner can handle from a budget perspective. This slide is just kind of showing you the overall of the site. You see those kind of challenging forms with the bay windows, these kind of awkward reentrant corners. We've got little pediments on top. These buildings aren't considered historic in Boston. They have kind of historic little nuances, but there wasn't really anything we were compelled or required to keep or recreate. But for the most part, we are maintaining the overall look of the buildings, just with new materials and an overclad. And so before construction started, really, we have a contractor on board. They've been with us this whole process. And one of the first things we needed to do was to really understand what was going on with the existing facade now. And I mentioned the building was built in 1890s or thereabouts. It's been renovated multiple times. Both the exterior, as you can see on the left, with this kind of really intense buildup of maybe 4 different cladding systems that they just kept, putting on top. And then there's been some, finally we're doing it right. We're taking it all off and we're unveiling some, in some cases, significant rot. So there's some repair work that needs to happen there. This is the original kind of horizontal skip sheathing that you're seeing there. And then what you're seeing in here, I think, is actually what's interesting about this building is that at some point, the owner or the previous owner completely spray foamed all of the walls, the roof, and the basement ceiling. So we oddly have like a baseline, pretty good thermal envelope, not great, it's not airtight, and the systems aren't efficient, but we started off with a little boost in that this thing was insulated, which was not what we always see or expect. And so right away, this section just kind of showing you the thermal envelope. The yellow is meant to express the added thermal envelope, with the understanding that there's spray foam in the rafters, between the rafters and the roof. There's spray foam in the basement ceiling, and there's spray foam in the existing structural wood studs. Everything else is additive outside of that existing sheathing. And then a really quick wall section that kind of elaborates a little bit more on existing versus new, existing being the gray, the new being the yellow, overclad, all site built. We're essentially just using we're resheathing the whole building with a zip panel. We're making it airtight at the layer of the zip. And then we're installing wood bucks around all the windows. Those get flashed and made airtight. The windows get installed in the bucks so that you have a moment in time where there's 2 windows installed. You have your new window in the buck, your existing window in the unit where someone is still living. And then the overclad insulation, in this case, is 5.5 inches of wood fiber board. And then we just have a wood strapping with a fiber cement kind of lap siding that closely resembles the original cladding detailing. And then here's some photos of that in progress. So this, like I said, this is actively under construction. They're wrapping up their second relocation this week. So we've already got one duplex completely turned over, all systems up and running, people back in their units, and we're about to be done with another 2. And while they're doing that, they're kind of simultaneously attacking the facade. So I believe all the windows are installed at this point, and they're now kind of going through and strategically installing the wood fiber where it makes most sense. So we've got like kind of a mishmash of exposed zip and wood fiber going up now. And then so here's some details that just kind of show this middle photo here and on the right, this weird reentrant corner. We're dealing with the existing concrete, not a lot of site work, not a lot of site scope for this project. The buildings are pretty densely laid out on the site. So we're working with what we have and dealing with those kind of oddball connections. We've actually cut back the steps so that we can install a thermal break there. But at the same time, you have to be really mindful that these stairs are active all the time. There's never really a time when they're not being used for egress because the buildings are occupied while this exterior work is happening. So it's been a really intricate kind of dance of tearing something down to the extent that you can work on it while still maintaining life safety has been an interesting challenge. And then on the left here, you can see a hint of some of the ductwork that still does run on the exterior just for shorter length. So it's coming up from the basement, popping out through an existing opening in the foundation, and then it's going to be embedded essentially in this new overclad insulation when all is said and done. This is a quick detail on the kind of typical window and door install. So we've got those wood bucks, which they built on site and just kind of installed and clipped onto the building, air sealed them and made them weather tight. And then later they come in and they install the windows in those bucks. And here's a few photos of that. So you see it kind of in progress on the left where you've got the raw wood and the sill is flashed. They've got the little clips, how we attach to the zip. And then in the middle, we've now flashed the whole thing. And then finally, we're starting to install some windows within that buck. So these windows went up pretty quick throughout the whole project and without really any impact on the people on the interior. So this project, while maybe from a replicability standpoint, didn't pan out exactly as how we started, where we thought we could really panelize this thing. But I think where it's become really helpful is that we're kind of proving the assembly as a meaningful site build assembly for this type of building. It certainly depends on what's going on existing in the existing assembly too, that needs to be considered. But for this building, it's less of a replicable from that perspective. Everything from the cladding or panelization perspective is not replicable because we didn't do that. But systems and everything that we're selecting are very straightforward. There's nothing special about the water heaters, the HVAC equipment. It's all pretty, Passive House typical off the shelf, I'll say, ERVs and things like that. So we're not doing anything particularly special here. And we'll get into that a little bit here, but you'll see heat pump hot water heaters replacing existing gas-fired water heaters kind of in kind in the same place. We're not changing any of the piping connections. ERVs being installed, one per unit. Those are installed in the basement. The ducts go from the ERVs, they make their way to the exterior. And then for the most part, the routing is on the interior, but there is some exterior routing as well when needed. And then each unit gets its own ducted heat pump system. So those will have the condensers outside, and then we have wall-mounted heads on the interior. So pretty typical stuff in that, each bedroom gets a heat pump head. Sometimes there's a third bedroom. In that case, we don't have a heat pump head there, but kitchen and bath exhaust is how it was before. We're just kind of reconnecting the ERV to what was existing. And a quick diagram there to kind of show kind of the new work impact. So here's that photo of the ducts exiting the basement through an old opening, an old masonry opening, and up and through this kind of coping datum line until we get into the framed portion above. Well, then they'll travel over to their point of destination. And a few more photos. I think the two on the right are really meant to kind of show like the really limited impact we're trying to have on the interiors. It's really about the HVAC routing, more or less. So those 2 weeks they have in the apartment is all about getting the ducts in the right spot. It's all about getting the heat pumps installed and all of the condensate and conduit that needs to get to it. And then it's a little bit of finishes. But other than that, it's a pretty low light touch to the interior of the units themselves. And so after all of that, we still have solar. We have the opportunity to put solar on these things. And in this case, we're dealing with some kind of odd setback requirements. The city of Boston was requiring us, they gave us some leniency off party walls, but not every party wall. So we ended up with about 16 panels per roof. So per the 10 lots. And that ends up being a 67.6 kilowatt array, which, if you remember, we started at a 59.2 EUI, which is not as awful as we've seen. After just DER improvements, we can get down to an 11.7 EUI projected, of course. And then when we finally add in that solar, the projected EUI comes down to about a 2.6, which is pretty awesome. We're happy with that number for sure. So all of this is really expensive. It's a very expensive project. All of the DERs are expensive when you start to look at them. So there's a number of sources that will build up and satisfy the budget. And this, I'm by no means an expert, and a lot of this information was provided directly from the developer, so I'm kind of interpreting it. But you'll see we've got 13 items on this list to get to the 100% budget total. And for this case, it actually includes soft costs and developer fees folded into this total. So some of these grants, for instance, can go towards soft costs, while others are more for hard costs. But you'll see that we've got a variety of stuff going on here. Number one being the actual perm loan for the developer. And then the second biggest one, this community mitigation fund, this 21.54% is actually like a Massachusetts state fund that I guess collects taxes from casinos and things like that, and then redistributes that money to the community in ways that are beneficial to the community. So that's what that big number is there. But then after that, we start to see these decarbonization programs jumping in, these 11.5%. This Climate Ready Housing is a state program in Massachusetts. The decarbonization grant, the DOER, is another program for decarbonization. And then right behind those two, the 10.77% of the budget is the retrofit fund of the city of Boston. So I think all this is to say is that while this resolved itself, I think it took a ton of time for the developer to get to this point, and a lot of kind of savvy maneuvering to be able to achieve all of the requirements of being able to apply for these things. It takes time, it takes money, and it takes some expertise. So let me go to the next slide here where we'll talk about the actual costs, so then you can start to understand what those numbers prior meant. But I'm going to focus on hard costs just because that's what I have to compare for the next project, listing the soft cost and developer fee just as a FYI because we have it. But the hard cost for the project was a $4.2 million construction project. For 20 units, that comes down to $210,000 per unit. And for gross square foot, 161. And for envelope, which in this case, I'm considering the walls and the roof at $130 per envelope square foot. So you can start to see what a project like this costs, and hopefully you get an understanding of what the scope actually is, that there's very, very limited interior scope included in these numbers. It truly is envelope and systems only. And so I'm going to jump to the next project. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but which is the Fairweather Apartments in Salem, Massachusetts. This project is so close to being under construction. Maybe next week is the official starting date. Some of the work is in progress, I'll say, because we're doing somewhat of a phased approach. But really quickly, the building stats. It's built in 1967. Very little alterations, some minor stuff most recently in 2007. It's a non-combustible constructed building. It is 6 stories. It is not technically a high-rise, which is actually ended up being pretty important. It's close, but not quite. Structural steel frame, masonry exterior walls. It's like a CMU, a concrete block with a brick veneer is what's going on at the exterior. Really small partial basement that has the hot water equipment. 127 units, and they're majority studios. Some of the challenges for this building include the huge mess of stuff on the roof that has nothing to do with how the building operates and everything to do with cell phone equipment and antenna. So I think they have 2 or maybe 3 or 4 different cell phone rooftop tenants, and their equipment is everywhere. It's on the building. You can kind of see it in this photo here. It's on the elevator tower, and this photo here doesn't really do it justice, but it's all over the roof. There's conduit, there's everything, cable trays all over the place. So that has been a huge challenge just in dealing with those people, getting them to be on the same page and agreeing to kind of move with us with our improvements that we propose. Also a little bit challenging, but not as much as we originally thought, was the steep slope. And that's more from like a constructability as far as getting equipment on site. We've probably got about 10 to 15 feet around the whole perimeter of the building before the slope really drops off in some areas. So it's workable, but something that needed to be considered. And then the really interesting thing is that this building is one of 4 buildings built from the same set of details. So while the plans are different, the plans of each of those 4 apartment buildings, they respond to their own sites. They have different kind of layouts. The actual details, the wall assemblies, the kind of structural direction, the window types are all from the same set of drawings. So theoretically, the idea was that we arrive at a solution for this building, which is one of the bigger ones, I think, and we would have encountered all of the complexities that we may encounter for her sister buildings, the other 3 Fairweathers. So if we could achieve a really good product here and a really great solution here, the replicability would be somewhat directly correlated to another 600 or so apartments in those 4 buildings in total. So that was kind of the bigger zoomed out goal. The existing utility structure, everything's paid by the owner, which is definitely helpful when we're considering some of these upgrades. The building has a cogen and gas, hot water, and hydronic baseboard heating, and through-wall air conditioner units that just go through these little holes in the building, these sleeves, and they'll put a cap on it in the winter, but it's, more or less just air passing through the building. Has an existing air handler, although it's been non-functional for years, and then kitchen and bath are ducted and exhausted through the roof, which ended up being a really good thing for our solution. So when we look at the existing energy performance, that estimated baseline EUI, and try to figure out how to qualify this building, we looked at it as though the AHU was running, because it should be for code purposes. And with that, we were coming up with a number of 165 kBTU per square foot year. So a really, really, really poor performing building, and seemed really ripe for some intervention. I'm going to do this really quickly. I'm just trying to show you, again, in this project, the name of the game for interior scope was like, don't touch anything. If you don't need to touch it, don't touch it. There's a little bit of rework in what's blue here, which is really a result of the owner saying, like, if we're going to be here, let's carve a few more offices out for our admin. Let's make this space work a little bit better. But other than that, scope to interior units, scope to the community room is very, very minor. The one thing we did need to do is we need to add an electrical room to the first floor, because the current electrical room in the basement wasn't going to satisfy the new electrical equipment. So that was some new work there that is necessary and related directly to the DER. So the typical upper floor, which it's 6 stories, so floors 2 through 6 are essentially duplicates. The real work there is at the end of the corridor, where we are adding corridor specific ERVs. And those ERVs, the reason they're not tied into the rest of the building is also one of the reasons we've made a lot of the decisions we've made, is that the building fire alarm system cannot support installation of smoke dampers. So everything we're doing, you'll see as I continue down this route of how we're handling HVAC, is kind of in response to that major issue, is that we cannot install and rewire the whole building for a new fire alarm system just because of HVAC upgrades. So we're finding ways around that. And so keeping the ERV corridors, servicing only the corridors, meant that they don't need smoke dampers, which became really critical. And then in the typical unit, as far as like how are we impacting the occupants, again, really, 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 really minimally. And in this case, relocation is like a day at a time. So nobody's actually needing to leave. Nobody needs to pack up their unit. And while that's great for the occupant, it's also great for the owner, because the cost to relocate can be exorbitant. So the scope is really to, as part of the electrical service upgrade and part of the electrification of the whole building, getting rid of gas, everybody's getting new electrical panels or tenant load centers, and the feeders to them are getting replaced. That work is actually already done. They've been doing that since late spring. We're going to be reconnecting kitchen and bath exhaust locations in the exact same locations. We don't want to change the size of them. We don't want to open up any code anomalies by modifying them. So they're going to be cleaned and aero sealed, but the actual duct from the kitchen and bath to the roof remains the same. They'll get new grills and registers, but other than that, they're existing to remain. The existing kind of hydronic heat at the perimeter is going to stay on until the electrification process is complete and all systems are a go and running, and then that'll be decommissioned eventually. And then the other major work is really at the facade and how the window will interact with the new heating and cooling equipment. So we'll have a fan coil unit located in the room or in the unit. It'll be in generally the same location as the air conditioning sleeve was. So it's like, as far as from the tenant perspective, not much has changed. We're not taking up any more space. We're not building a closet. There's not a soffit. There's not condensate running all over the place. So visually, it'll look more or less the same. And then the other change will be the fresh air supply, which is going to be integrated into the panelized window and the overall panelized approach, the overclad, which I'll get into in a minute. And then so quickly moving to the roof, I mentioned before, there's a ton of stuff on the roof. Now we're adding even more stuff. We have 2 energy recovery units kind of per wing, basically one here and one here that will serve for fresh air, ventilation, and exhaust to each portion of the building, the residential portion of the building primarily. So that requires dunnage, more steel, some decking. And that's where some of the kind of intricate dance with the antenna and cell service providers is coming into play, is that we're now going to be kind of hopefully consolidating all of that stuff onto our dunnage and making it as neat and tidy as it can be without disrupting their service or changing their design, their RF design. So the other part that's important about this plan to understand is the big major move for the HVAC system was to avoid impacting the tenants while still having a semi-centralized ventilation system, was to take the fresh air supply duct from the ERUs to the roof, which is the blue shaded ductwork on this roof plan. And you'll see we're going to the perimeter on the whole building, and then we are dropping down, and we're dropping down our supply ducts in an interstitial space between the existing building and the new panel. So we've got 9 inches of gap, we'll call it, between existing and new, from which we will run all of our fresh air ductwork, along with condensate and refrigerant line sets for the new fan coils. So it just, all this kind of serves to lessen the impact on the folks who are living there now, which is an elderly population. Red on this sheet is those are the existing through roof exhaust locations. So we're going from our ERUs and we're just connecting back into those. So it's really just supply ductwork that's running down the face of the building. And then really quickly, here's our yellow is new equipment. You'll see we tried really hard to not have all of this stuff, but I wish we could get more of it on the roof, but line sets are kind of making us negotiate a perimeter approach. So we've got new equipment on the dunnage, we've got new heat pumps around the perimeter, as well as a few on the roof. And then in a really quick kind of diagrammatic way of showing, this is the ductwork kind of, pulled out from the rest of the building. You're really just seeing the pathway of the fresh air from the ERU, getting to the roof edge perimeter, snaking down, and getting to the units. I'm going to go through this quickly because I know we're probably running out of time, but the image on the left, I think, is the most helpful. So again, related to not being able to have smoke dampers. What that meant for us here was we can only connect 2 stories at a time by code. So in an ideal world, we probably could have run one big wide duct and just hopped off at every unit and done it that way. But because we're limited to the kind of code complexities of the existing building and its infrastructure, what it can and cannot support, we're taking one duct all the way down, keeping it local to 2 floors, a second duct down to floors 3 and 4, and then another set of ducts from 4 and 5. And so we end up with this kind of this is the most typical pattern we have. It's sometimes a little atypical, but how we can serve every single unit with fresh air. And so you'll see we're going into the jams, and I have a detail on the next sheet, but this wall section here is just kind of showing the roof at the top, roof ductwork transitioning into the parapet, which is site built. And then once we get to about the existing roof line is where the panels really start, as far as the top of panel. And then you're seeing we've got some 2-hour infill at the former air conditioning sleeve, so create some fire stopping situations for our condensate refrigerant. And then at the bottom of the building, sitting these panels on a concrete curb, essentially, that we'll site built around the perimeter, and having our condensate and refrigerant line sets exit out through the bottom there. And so this is another project where we have the contractor on board. It's the same contractor as the other project too. So there's been some mock-ups, and there will be more mock-ups too, even though we're about to start construction. There's enough kind of complexity here that we feel like we need to kind of follow through on some things first. So this is just a mock-up of what the interior fan coil unit looks like. Obviously, it won't be plywood in reality, but for now. And then down here, this blue paint, this is a mock-up of what I'll get to in a moment, which is we've got a 2 air barrier system. We've got an air barrier painted on the existing brick, which is the blue stuff. And then we'll have an air barrier kind of midpoint in our panel. And then the real complexity is connecting them at the top and bottom and at every opening. But what this is doing is just showing in a really quick way everything that will be behind the panel before they put the panel up. So we'll have ductwork. It's going to arrive in a jam, and that's your fresh air. We'll have line sets and condensate, and they're going to be organized and coming out of that former AC sleeve opening, and they will be riding up and down that building attached to the blue painted brick prior to the panel install. These top details are just kind of showing the intended jam fresh air register locations in the building there. And so really quickly, replicability from systems perspective, we're again not using anything too special, especially for a building of this scale. Whether or not we were going to feed the ductwork down the building or somehow get it in the building itself through the core, the equipment likely wouldn't change. So there's nothing special there. And from an occupant impact, I think I mentioned from the interior perspective, not much really changed visually as far as like how systems impact your unit. And then, so here's the reference to the primary and the secondary air barrier. So the primary air barrier in this case being the red dashed line kind of up against the existing gray, which is that painted solution. And then the secondary being one of the components of the panel, which is going to be, it's a metal framed panel. And then we've got a layer of continuous, structurally insulated continuous insulation. So the back side of that structurally insulated sheathing is considered our secondary air barrier. So that gets joints taped and sealed. And then the real complexity is making that connection on all sides as those two need to meet. So we've got a variety of kind of top of wall, we've got openings, and then we've got bottom of wall that we need to kind of contest with. And then on the right here, the yellow is just indicating here's our thermal improvements. The existing building has almost no insulation value whatsoever. I think there's a very small layer of rigid insulation behind the drywall, but that's kind of it. So we're coming in with the panel itself, which has the structurally insulated sheathing is about an R21 in and of itself, and then we're going to fill the cavity with R14 mineral batt. So it will be a pretty significant improvement from a thermal perspective. And then as far as you'll see in the bottom here, another mock-up. This mock-up is more than a year old now, and things have certainly changed. And I'll say the cladding is not at all what we will have. It'll look quite different. But I think the basics are there. So we've got this panel that's essentially going to have these brackets, which are a little hard to see, but in blue here and in plan here, this nested channel bracket, which gets affixed to the existing building. and then these arms that affix to the bracket itself that then plug into the top of the panel. And so the panels will be stacked and they will eventually land on a new site-built reinforced concrete curb. And then you can kind of see here's our 9-inch gap for all of the things that need to happen in order to make the systems work. Here's a little diagram of how some of these things are coming together. There's a really complicated code approach to this, which if I can get into if we have time, but that in and of itself took a lot of finessing and understanding kind of the limits of the existing building, the limits of the materials we were using on the cladding or the panels, and trying to find really creative ways to deal with the complexities of needing to move air in ducts in a gap between two spaces, and how to consider that from a code perspective. This project was part of a feasibility study that we started with RMI, and for that feasibility study, they did a preliminary embodied carbon analysis, and just really quickly, assuming 60% energy reduction, we were looking at an embodied versus operational carbon payback period of 3.4 years. If you assume an 80% energy reduction, it's more like 1.23. And I think, if looking at what I'll get to in a moment about the solar, I think that number could be even less because I think we're in a 90% energy reduction projection right now. So really quick, here's what we're thinking the actual overclad might look like. It's a mix of single skin metal panel. We've kind of got this woven pattern, and thinking about signage. The other good thing is I think where we're headed with the antennas is that we will get these off of our building and they will be more so affixed to the structural steel that's going to support our solar canopy, which is not yet in this rendering that we need to update. So give a better understanding of what this might look like. But as far as replicability, we're finding the panelization here obviously still makes sense. We're about to start it. The systems are not complex. And then from an occupant impact, we feel like we've achieved the goal of really, really minimizing that. And then really quickly, here's our solar. So one of the funding sources for this particular project requires the project to be net zero. Whether you do that on site or whether you have off site or whether you purchase, you need to get there. So while our rooftop dunnage was expanding due to equipment, due to coordinating with the cell service folks, the idea came that we should just add a second tier and see how much solar can we get, what can we really do on site. And so we end up with a really simple canopy design, but a really impactful array, a 220 kilowatt array on top of the building. And it will have no impact on the cell service equipment below, so it should be a win-win for everyone. Here you'll see our pre-DER energy use, 165, really, really bad. Our projected energy use with the DER kind of envelope systems improvements, air tightness improvements, getting down to that kind of sweet spot, that 24, right where we want to be. And then once we get that huge array in there, we're coming down to a 12.9 EUI. So the funding structure for this project, fewer on the list than the first one, but different kind of look at things here. So the biggest one being the GRP HUD, which is a federal funding source, and as far as we know is maybe not coming back. They just did their last kind of release in September. So nearly 35% of the budget for this project was satisfied by that. That is the funding source that requires net zero. So it is very it's a very strict and it is hard to meet, but this project was receiving a good chunk of money from that. After that, we got our decarbonization grant, Mass DOER, same as the last project. And then this project actually has a private donor at a pretty significant amount of money. So I don't have soft costs and development costs for this project, so I'm going to focus on this, but the hard cost, all in electrification and DER solar is coming in at 21,300,000. That equates to about 167,800 per unit, about 288 per gross square foot, and about $401 per envelope. And envelope in this case, again, is just walls and roof. So if we really talk about the strategies and pathways for financing these things, there's really two overall pathways. It's the standard affordable housing preservation funds, which are managed by the state housing financing agencies. In the case of both these projects being in Massachusetts, if they had gone this route, that would have been mass housing. Neither of these have, for this particular, these two examples are not going through that process. But it's a single funding round every year. It's very competitive. It can often take multiple submissions, so you could be looking at multiple years before you get the results you're looking for. And the whole time you need to be shovel ready. So you have to kind of drag your design team along with you. You need to be able to pay for those the fee to be shovel ready. The other kind of pot or pathway is the decarbonization fund. So we've got some of these include money to be able to fund your pre-development. Some of them funnel multiple sources of federal and state and local into one fund and then distribute. You can go to private foundations. They're each going to have their own different energy reduction goals. Electrification is almost always required. And then the timelines vary too. And they also want you to be shovel ready. So, and of course, some of them require some pretty strict qualifications for your team. So you really need to start building your team early for some of these programs. And then I think we're rounding out on the slides here very quickly. It seemed like this was going to be an interest, so I wanted to put this in. But to quickly talk about some of these, the Green and Resilient Retrofit Program, GRRP, which is the HUD funding that Salem Fairweather received. That was the bulk of their budget. The Leading Edge program, that requires you to be net zero. You can get up to $60,000 per dwelling unit. Department of Energy rebates, so that's the HEHR, which Salem also took advantage of. 14,000 per dwelling unit, 8,000 per dwelling unit for the secondary program there. And then that is money that's the state needs to basically ask for it from the federal government. So you might run into different situations in each state. But LISC, the Climate Ready Housing Program, you need to be able to prove that you can reduce your heating loads by 50% to be eligible. And they have a little bit of flexibility on timeline there, understanding that capital improvements may require an incremental approach. Lean multifamily, similar to the list, you need to prove you reduce your heating loads except by 40%, and you can receive up to $350 per MMBTU reduced. And then the last one, I'm just going to highlight the Low and Moderate Income Housing Decarbonization Grant Program, which is a Massachusetts program, but it funnels in federal money as well as state money. You can get up to $40,000 per dwelling unit if you have more than 6 units. So that I'm sure I went over time, but there's more if you want more. But for now, I think I could also cede to you, Scott, for questions.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Your presentation was so chock full of information. I can tell the audience that it will be posted on the website next week, and they can absorb some of the detail that you've provided with that presentation. So thank you very much for that.
Sure.
We actually only have time for a couple of questions. There was a comment on your first example, and I don't know if it's just a comment or a question, but to hear how the exterior run HVAC would affect the derating of the envelope. That's something we were chatting about with these AC units on the outside. That must be a major challenge for the rating of the building.
As far as running the ductwork on the exterior in the first, yeah. So it's insulated, and then we're insulating over it. We basically are trying to arrive at an equivalent level of insulation anytime we have ductwork running on the exterior. So there's never a time when it won't essentially be buried in insulation when we're done with it.
Okay. One of the things we chatted about was the idea of measuring performance, because you've got a lot of estimates and calculations on what should be the outcome. Is there any kind of a mechanism or a process that you either have or would like to see that you can see how the building actually performs once the construction's done and how that endures over time?
Yeah. That's definitely a goal of ours. For the Salem project, the client is very savvy, and the systems in place and the monitoring in place, I think, will make it really easy to kind of collect that data and understand it pretty readily. It also helps that they pay all utilities, so that they kind of own that information too. There's no kind of like seeking it out. Um, for Hano, the smaller project, that's also utilities will be paid for by the owner as well. The monitoring won't be as robust. It's going to be more like the typical kind of info you can get from the equipment, I'll say. Um, but it is something we are definitely interested in understanding. And I think given our relationship with the clients, we'll be able to collect that information because we want it as much as they want it. You know, we feel like we need to prove this stuff out with all the effort we've put in. We can't just leave it hanging. So yeah, it's definitely a goal for us.
Well, actually, if you want to do the next project, being able to show what you were able to do on the last project would be a great vehicle of getting the information out.
Yeah.
We've got a question that's come in on the Hano project. You talked about these foam that was sprayed in there and you left it there. Did you ever think about removing that foam? And if not, why did you keep it?
Yeah, I think the easy answer is it would have involved like complete destruction of the interior of the unit. And the primary goal walking in there was we started off saying let's not move anybody out. We backed off of that slowly as the HVAC layout started to lend itself to needing to be more interior focused. But I think that would have been a huge undertaking that we really didn't even discuss going there. I think it was always understood. It's here, it's staying, it's for the purposes of our energy model, we've derated it to a certain extent, so we're not necessarily relying on it so much. A, because we don't know how well it was installed from what we can see. You know, I've only seen so many openings. Um, and B, I don't even think we know the date it was installed. It's kind of mysterious in that way. So, um, yeah, it was never really a huge discussion as to whether or not it would be removed.
Okay, I've got two hyper quick questions. One came in on the chat. Do you have an estimate of how much appreciation in the value of the apartments from the work that's being done, added market value?
Not yet.
Not
We've
yet.
got two tenants moved back in on the Hano project. Um, and so it will be good to hear feedback. It'll be good to hear feedback because the systems are completely changing too. They have to kind of get used to stuff. They have to understand, you know, how the controls are different from what they were expecting or were used to. Um, I'm hoping it's all positive, but it is yet to be determined.
Okay. Um, One of the arguments has been made, particularly from the passive house community, that if you're going to do a retrofit, you should really do the whole 9 yards, the whole retrofit opportunity. Don't do a partial retrofit. That if you're going to do it and it's going to be around for 50 years, you've got to do it right. I'd be interested in your views on that perspective. And then secondly, coming to codes and regulations, it seems like you've been hugely constrained with your options because of the way codes are done. Do you have any thoughts on maybe performance-based codes as opposed to outcome-based codes as opposed to prescriptive codes? I'd be interested in your views on both of those points.
Yeah. So I'll say on the code thing, I feel like where the codes have really um, not stopped us, but really made us pause and go, is not the energy code so much, but the building code isn't meant to deal with some of these interventions. Like even with existing building codes, there's gray areas where you wonder, you know, how does this matter, or do I consider this or not? So we've had to rely pretty heavily on code consultants to really guide us on some of these super complex um, maneuvering of systems, for instance, in the 9-inch gap and being really careful that it's not a shaft. It can't be a shaft. We can't create a shaft in this wall. How do we overcome that in a safe and practical way and a cost-effective way too? So I feel like for code, that's been the hiccup is that it's just not made for an overclad solution in that way and the
Mhm.
intricacies that come with it. And then tell me again the first part of the question.
Well, the first part of the question, we're actually down to less than a minute for you on
Okay.
that one. But what do you think about the idea of retrofits doing all of it and
Yep.
not just staging it?
Yep. So that's a great question because we have studied like tiers of retrofitting and the cost that might be associated with it, the dollar cost. But then what do you get from that really, as far as like your energy performance goals and your reduction? And what we found is that like the cost to fully go electric, if that's always included in your tiers, which when we studied it, we did. We said you always have to go full electric. That's the number one thing. Um, all of the sudden, tier one, which is kind of just like replace windows with better-ish windows, replace equipment in kind, but don't reduce your loads, seal where you can, that starts to make no sense. That makes absolutely no sense because you now need to pay to electrify everything. Your utility bills are just going to get blown up. Um, Tier three, I'll say, is what is represented by the projects I presented today, which is the all-in approach. Tier two, the midpoint, I think there are times when that starts to make sense. The added layer of complexity is that in Boston, for instance, there's essentially like a tax for your carbon emissions. If you cannot prove your carbon emissions reductions by X amount, you get taxed for it or you get fined for it. And so all of a sudden, tier one and tier two make no sense in Boston, and everybody's got to go tier three. So I think there's a time and a place for a tier two, which is like air sealing, new windows, not necessarily any new insulation, maybe depending on the building, but really focusing on better systems. I think there's a place for that. For us, though, with all the kind of programs in place, tier three seemed to be the one that makes the most sense.
Okay.
From like a code and a economics
Well,
perspective.
thank you very much for that. I'm going to have to cut it off because I see that Barbara Ann's about to yell at me. There have been a lot of compliments in the chat, and there are also more questions that we don't have time to get to. But I'd like to thank you very much for your great presentation, and I'll turn it over to Barbara Ann.
Absolutely, Scott. Thank you so much, Cara, for that was a really great presentation that was so in-depth and interesting. Thank you so much. And Scott for getting those few questions in. It's important to get the questions asked because that's what people want to know. Everyone, this video, this webinar will be available on our website next at sometime, maybe by the end of this week, but definitely by early next week, and you can all view it there. Cara, really well done. Thank you so much. Our next webinar will be on Wednesday, December 11th, again from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. Irish time. And our guest that day will be Barry McCarran. He's Managing Director at Core Retrofit and a former lecturer and acting head of business at Southwest College in Enniskillen in Northern Ireland. So I suppose he'll be doing retrofit on this side of the Atlantic. So it's a nice balance. Thank you all for joining us. Really sorry for running a minute over time. I know you all have to run to other meetings. But thank you so much. And as I said, the recording of this webinar is available on our website. Thank you all.
Yep, thank you.
Thanks, Cara. Bye-bye, everybody. Have a good week.